Hi, third graders. I wanted to share with you one of my favorite books when I was in elementary school, and it is Sideways Stories from Wayside School. It's by Louis Sachar. He's also one of my favorite authors. You may have read the book Holes or even seen the movie. It's a little bit older, but it's still a good one. And I'm going to read the back for you to give you a little preview. So this is your school just a little too normal? Maybe you should go to Wayside School. You'll meet Bibi, the fastest draw in art class, John, who only reads upside down, and Sammy, the new kid. He's a real rat. Come on, hurry up. If you're late for class, Mrs. Gorf will turn you into an apple. Oops, sorry about that. And then there are also a couple other books that go in this series. There's Wayside School is Falling Down and Wayside School Gets a Little Stranger. So this school is a very, very tall building. And each chapter you're going to meet a new character or a new student, and they're all just a little bit wacky. So here we go. John was one of the smartest boys in Mrs. Jewell's class, but he had one problem. He could only read words written upside down. Nobody ever wrote anything upside down, but it was only a little problem. John was still in the high reading group. He just turned his book upside down. It was easier for John to turn his book upside down than to learn to read correctly, but the easiest way isn't always the best way. Mrs. Jewell said, "John, you can't go on reading like this. You can't spend the rest of your life turning books upside down." "Why not?" asked John. "Because I said so," said Mrs. Jewell. "Besides, what happens when I write something on the blackboard? You can't turn the blackboard upside down." "No, I guess you're right," said John. "I know I'm right," said Mrs. Jewell. "You're going to have to learn to read. You're going to have to learn to stand on your head." So he's telling the teacher she needs to stand on her head. He's not going to change his ways. All right. Introduction. This book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them, there's something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to be only one story high with 30 classrooms all in a row. Instead, it's 30 stories high with one classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. The children at Wayside like having a sideways school. They have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 13th story of Wayside School. It's been said that these stories are strange and silly. That's probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly. That's probably also true. All right, we're going to meet the teacher, Mrs. Gorf. Try to show you her little picture here. She's got a bunch of apples on her desk. All right, and kind of a lizard-like tongue. All right, Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. "If your children are bad," she warned, "or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples." Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. So he couldn't even count, but he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. "Hey, that isn't fair," said Todd. "John was only trying to help a friend." Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears. First her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. "Does anyone else have an opinion?" she asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. "I don't allow crying in the classroom," said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet, and when they went home, they were too scared to even talk to their parents. But Joe, John, and Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. The parents were worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late to school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "God bless you," when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of apples and very little students. Terrence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Mauricia opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue, and Mauricia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Miss Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The three Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. John, Joe, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrence, Mauricia, and the three Erics. Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Lewis, the art teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher. So many children bring her apples. He walked back down to the playground. I kind of thought that too when I saw the picture. I'm like, oh, she must be well-liked, but not so much. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Lewis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He saw 20 more apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home, she said. I don't have to teach anyone. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again. You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. Uh-oh. Stop, she shouted, or I'll turn you into applesauce. But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children, Todd demanded. Miss Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, and this time her left one first, and then her right, and she turned the apples back into children. All right, said Mauricia, let's go get Lewis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Mrs. Gorf. I'll turn you back into apples. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Miss Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple, but none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Lewis and the art teacher walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf? He asked. No one said a word. Uh-oh. Boy, am I hungry, said Lewis. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many. He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it up on his shirt, and ate it. And that was the end of Mrs. Gorf. Chapter 2, we will start next week, which is Mrs. Jewls. So she's got, some monkeys, pictures hanging up in the background, so we'll meet her next week.